Captain Magnus Biskopstollen, known to his friends as the Bishop, ducked under the tent flap and emerged into the pre-dawn twilight. Took a deep breath of the cool air and idly waved the cloud of mosquitoes away from his face. At these latitudes in the high summer, the air in the morning was still fresh, but it also tended to come with a full complement of insect life. Mulling over the briefing that he'd just attended, he walked slowly through the trees to the edge of the road that until a day ago had been a back road between Boden and Gamelstaden in the Swedish countryside at the head of the Gulf of Bothnia. Now, instead, it had become a military installation. This was Road Base 15, home for a little under 24 hours now to a squadron of AJ-37 Viggen attack jets. The jets were hidden amongst the pine trees over an area of several hectares, along with the fuel and ammunition dumps, as well as all of the services needed to keep the jets flying and fighting. It had all happened so fast, mused Bishop. Barely a week ago, he'd been relaxing with friends in the bar in Stockholm, enjoying the long, warm evening hours and talking about how it looked like the Soviets really were going to attack NATO. Now suddenly, not only had the war come to NATO, it had also come to Sweden, as the Soviet Union seemed to have decided that neutral was another word for pushover when it came to the Swedes. Well, they were in the process of finding out how wrong they were, and Bishop was looking forward to doing his part to convince them. Yesterday, with no prior warning, the Soviets had launched an air assault on the Swedish Bothnian coast, thinking that it presented a soft underbelly route around Norwegian resistance along the coast of the Norwegian Sea. They'd seized a small port of Luleå, which the Russians called Novorossiysk. The defenders of the port had been overwhelmed and had beat a hasty retreat, but not before they had at least partially demolished the port and the airfield. The defenders had then pulled back into the hills surrounding the port, and with the help of rapidly deployed reserves had established a perimeter around the Soviet incursion. That perimeter, though, had been dangerously close to the forward base for Bishop's unit, so they'd had to redeploy to this glorious outpost of civilization to carry on their war against the invader. As their last act from that base, though, the Viggens had exacted a measure of revenge by launching a surprise, dusk, low-level strike against the port and airbase, wreaking further havoc. Bishop himself had had the immense satisfaction of putting a load of rockets into a massive Soviet Aleutian transport as it was in the act of unloading. That had felt good. Now, barely 5 hours after having landed from that mission, he was making his way back out to his jet for another strike. The jet was already on the roadway, having been towed there by the ground team already. Not only that, but as he approached the jet, he realized it was already powered up with the engine at idle. He paused for a minute to contemplate the unique shape of the Viggen, its sleek double delta at once both beautiful and dangerous, like the flash of lightning for which he was named. Bishop loved flying the Viggen, built with really one job in mind: fly low and fast and appear out of nowhere, delivering precise and deadly strikes out of the clear blue sky. There was no plane like the Flash. Neither the Soviets nor the Americans had anything that could match her. His crew chief nodded as he walked up and raised an eyebrow. "I told us you'd be in a hurry this morning, so we got her fired up for you. I know you'll still want to do all your checks, but she's still ready to go." Bishop shook him by the hand and said thanks. He was right. Time was of the essence this morning, and not having to go through the startup would give him a chance to review the mission before he had to get airborne. He climbed up into the cockpit and accepted the ground crew's help in getting strapped in. He ran through his pre-flight checks and then looked at his watch. 5:25. He still had a few minutes before he needed to get airborne. He checked his kneeboard notes and mentally rehearsed the mission. The mission today was just down the coast from last night's mission, the port of Hagaviken, which the Russians called Gelendzhik for some reason. It was necessitated by the fact that someone had messed up. The docks and airport at Gelendzhik should have been demolished like those at Novorossiysk, but something had gone wrong. The defenders had left the area and left the port and airbase intact, and the Soviets had moved in overnight. If those facilities were not taken out, or at least degraded, there was no telling how fast the Soviets could reinforce their bridgehead. Certainly fast enough to overwhelm the defenders currently clinging to the hills above town. So today there was a joint operation in the works to put Gelendzhik out of action for good. A Special Forces amphibious team had been inserted by boat into the area around the airbase. They hoped that the Soviets would not have had time to dismantle the demolition charges that had been rigged, but which had not been set off. They were going to rewire them if they had to finish the job. As they were doing that, the Vigans were going to hit the port facilities, with the idea of both assisting with the withdrawal of the commandos and also taking advantage of the chaos the commandos were causing to make sure that if there were any air defenses that had been brought in, they were distracted. It meant, though, that timing was critical. The ops officer had made that very clear. He had to be over the target area no earlier than 5:42 and no later than 5:45. The commandos would be on radio silence, so there was no way to change those timings. They just had to be met. Bishop checked the time. 5:33. Time to get going. He made one last check, gave the chief the thumbs up, pressed down the toe brakes, and pushed the throttle to full burner. As he lifted off the brakes, the Vigan started rolling, slowly at first, but picking up speed quickly. His feet danced on the rudder pedals to keep the jet on the narrow roadway. Within a few seconds, he was bouncing all around the cockpit as the jet careened over the uneven pavement. Finally, the Vigan reached rotation speed. He pulled lightly back on the stick, the nose came up, and the vibration abruptly ceased. He was up. Checking to make sure he was actually climbing, he reached forward and flipped the lever to raise the gear. He kept his nose low to let the jet pick up speed. Once he was clear of the trees and his speed has climbed through 500 kilometers an hour, he pulled the throttle back a little to take the engine out of full afterburner. No sense in wasting all the fuel at the start of the mission. All right, time to get on with the route. The navigation system in the Vigan made this pretty easy. He rolled out his wings and made sure that he had the dot for the first waypoint in the middle of his heads-up display. It was still more than 20 kilometers away, so he had a while to get ready. He turned on his radar and set it to terrain clearance mode, and set its range to the minimum setting of 15 kilometers. He checked the clock. 5:35. His speed was 650 kilometers an hour. He was going to need to go a little bit faster in order to make the target window, so he left one segment of the afterburner on to keep building speed for a little while longer. He looked at the bright green screen of his radar. Anything on the ground that was higher than he was showed up as a dark spot. The higher it was, the darker it was. For now, he was in pretty good shape. For the next several kilometers, at least the next 10, there was really nothing but flat land ahead of him. After that, the land started to slope up towards the coastal hills, and there was a low ridge that was showing as being just a little bit above his flight path right now. That was just before his waypoint. After that, the real hills started, and they were definitely higher than he was, but he would be turning at his first waypoint, so he didn't have to go straight over them. The ops officer had told him that the waypoints that were programmed into his computer today were really just a way of making sure he stayed in the right valley. Yeah, there's no need for you to fly straight from one waypoint to the other. Just fly down the valley, make sure you keep the waypoint basically on track. You'll be fine. So that's what he was intending to do. It was easy at this part of the flight because it really didn't matter how high he flew. Once he got through the coastal hills, though, he was going to have to be very careful because he knew, as of last night, that the Soviets did have some SAM radars in place, and so he was going to have to stay low. But that was at least another 5 minutes from now, once he'd actually gotten through the hills. He checked the time. 5:37. 850 kilometers an hour. That was probably going to be about right. No need to adjust the speed any farther. He was coming up on the first low ridge between him and the coastal hills, so he raised his nose a little bit to get over it. The line of gray on his radar disappeared, showing him just a dark line of hills straight ahead, but also noting that they were on the other side of his waypoint, which showed up as a yellow circle on his radar. Once he hit that waypoint, he knew he was going to have to jog to the right and then eventually find a little saddle in the hills to flip over into the valley that would ultimately take him down to the coast. The first waypoint was approaching quickly now. The dial on the right-hand side of his cockpit showed them that he was less than 5 kilometers away, and that a little line at the bottom of his heads-up display was getting progressively shorter until it almost disappeared. When it did, he was going to have to turn to the right and pick up the next waypoint. Suddenly, the waypoint marker slid by to the left, meaning he was passing it. He banked slightly to the right, followed the cues in his HUD and in his cockpit until he was pointing again at his second waypoint. Checked his radar. Second waypoint was actually on the other side of the ridge, so he stayed a little bit to the right, keeping down in the bottom of the ridge and looking for a saddle that he could pop up over the ridge to get to his second waypoint. You could see it coming up on the left. A red light in the cockpit kept periodically flashing, telling him he was close to the ground. He was pretty sure it was okay. There was enough light for him to be able to see if he was in real trouble, but the radar was certainly helpful to help looking ahead to make sure he could plan his route. The saddle came up on the left. He banked the jet gently to the left, and then as he came over the top of the saddle, he banked back to the right, lined up on his second waypoint. All right, that was the first major hurdle. Now he was on his way down to the coast. Just had to find his way down this fairly narrow, winding valley. Now, the second waypoint had slid by, and now he was on to waypoint 3. It was behind a little hill, so he bent himself a little bit around to the left so that he could stay down in the bottom of the valley and not go up over top of the hill. Things were moving quickly now. As he came around the hill, he pulled slightly to the right and passed his third waypoint. Now the next waypoint was the big turn. This was the waypoint that was the base of a valley that ran to the northwest, just inside a line of hills that bordered the coast. It would be a big sweeping turn, about 60 or 70 degrees. And here it was coming up now. He banked the jet hard and pulled. He felt the forces of the G's, but not too badly. Kept pulling around and pulling around. He was up a little bit high as he went over a wooded hilltop, but came down the other side, pointed himself up the valley. Could tell that the ocean was on the other side of the line of hills to his left. Now it was time to start getting serious about getting low, so he worked his way down to the bottom of the valley. Could see, though, that there was another wooded hilltop he was going to have to go over before he got to his fifth waypoint, which was the point at which he would actually turn out towards the water. He checked the time. Right around 5:40. Good. He was about 2.5 to 3 minutes from the target. He'd arrived right in the middle of his window. The wooded hill that he'd been aiming to get over came up, and as he passed over the top, he bunted the nose down once again to get to the bottom of the valley. Once again, the horizontal line at the bottom of his heads-up display was getting awfully short. He could see the gap he had to shoot through out to the left, and he could see water on the other side. As waypoint number 5 slid by on his right, he banked the jet hard to the left and shot the gap between the two low hills out towards the coast. Got the jet even lower. Now was when things started to get interesting. The sixth waypoint was a waypoint between the two hills. Once he passed that, he had to bank left again. The seventh waypoint was actually out over the ocean. It was going to be a big, hard, long turn, about 120 degrees, but it was necessary to bring him back lined up with the docks at Galenzik. But he was going to want to stay low for that turn. It was also probably going to bleed off a lot of speed. He didn't want to carry a lot of speed into that turn, though. So he kept his speed off and he kept low, but he knew he was going to have to add power as soon as he finished that turn. Crossing the coastline out over the coast, he got to waypoint 7. Pulled the jet hard to the right, kept pulling and kept pulling and kept pulling. till the port came into view. See the port buildings. Now he needed to add some power. He flipped his HUD screen to the low position so he'd be able to see his CCIP pipper when he needed it. Looked at the target area and noticed that the commandos must have been busy. There was smoke and flame all over the airfield. As he reached the promontory opposite the harbor, he pulled up to about 150 meters so he could get a little bit of a perspective. From that height, he could see he was well lined up, going straight down the docks. He flipped the safety catch off the trigger and waited for the pipper to cover the target. When it did, he pressed the trigger and dispensed his 16 125-kilogram high-drag bombs, bent the jet hard to the right, and headed for the base of the ridge across the harbor. He stayed low until he got to the base of the ridge, and then he pulled up hard. There was a copse of trees on the top. He aimed for the left. As the nose of the jet approached the copse of trees, he flipped it over 120 degrees until he was inverted, pulled himself back down into the valley on the other side. It was done. The drop looked good from where he sat, but he couldn't tell. He'd have to ask later whether there was any bomb damage assessments from the commandos on the ground. For now, the job he had left was to get home. This was complicated by the fact that the navigation system in the Viggen actually only had room for 9 waypoints, and 8 had been used in getting him to the target precisely. The one waypoint left in the computer was the waypoint basically at the end of the runway. The only problem was that there were a couple of lines of hills between him and that waypoint. Those hills might very well have some Soviets in them, so he didn't dare get up too high. He needed to find a valley that was going to take him back to the plain on the other side of the coastal hills. So he turned to the left, popped over the next ridge, started looking at his radar to try and find a valley that would take him home. Ah yes, there was one. He knew he'd find it. Put the nose down into the valley, looked ahead on the radar, and basically just settled in to follow the valley back to the plain. Once he was there, he could fly straight to the waypoint, and it would just be time to land. He wondered how things had gone in the target area. Certainly seemed like the commandos had been effective. There was lots of flame and smoke as he flew by, but he really didn't get enough of a look to see what was going on. Sergeant Magnus Magnuson, known universally, of course, as Magnum, sighted down his rifle. The leaping flames from the airbase ammunition dump, or former ammunition dump to be a bit more accurate, made a lovely backdrop that silhouetted the Soviet troops pursuing his squad back down to the water's edge. He squeezed off 2 quick shots and watched in satisfaction as the shapes crumpled to the ground and didn't get up again. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw that the second fire team was on the beach. They were prone just in front of the boat, lying with their boots touching and their rifles covering a full arc from which any enemy troops might appear. Magnum grunted, "Up!" and as one, he and the other 2 members of his fire team jumped up and sprinted to the beach. As he passed the other fire team, he said, "Good enough, let's go!" They unfolded from the ground and piled into the boat behind Magnum and his team. The coxswain on the boat had it pointed out to sea, and as soon as the last boot hit the deck, he gunned the engine and headed across the bay. Magnum said, "All okay?" and was rewarded by 5 thumbs up and 5 smiling faces. They'd done it. They'd been helped by the fact that the Soviet troops that had been dispatched to take control of the airfield and the port had decided that they had time for a spot of looting and drinking before getting around to the task of cleaning up the explosives that had been left wired. It had almost been ridiculously easy to reconnect the demolition wiring, and right on schedule, both the ammunition and fuel dumps had gone up like the biggest fireworks you'd ever seen. And then the jets had appeared, going like stink, to drop those lovely, graceful parachute bombs that had blown the dockside to smithereens. After that, it had just been a matter of pepper potting back to the beach, one team covering the other, as they laid down protective fire to discourage any drunken heroes of the Soviet Union from taking too much interest in their departure. Well, it was done now. Just a matter of hunkering down out of the spray for the trip back across the bay. He wondered what would be for breakfast. Meanwhile, back just above Road Base 15, Bishop was turning on to final. He armed the thrust reverser, checked that his gear was down and locked, and completed the final lineup on the very narrow runway that was actually a highway. He jockeyed the throttle and the pitch of the nose to keep his angle of attack where it needed to be to keep from stalling, but not to be going too fast when he hit the runway. It was actually a pretty lengthy stretch of highway, but it still was very narrow, and he didn't want to be rolling down it any longer than he had to be. After a little bit of juggling from side to side, he managed to put it down close to the center of the highway. The thrust reverser kicked in, he started adding some brakes, and pretty soon the Viggen was rolling to a stop, and so was Bishop. After 2 sorties in barely more than 8 hours, he'd had just about enough for one day. A little bit of a lack of concentration at the end, he almost put the wheel off the highway, but he managed to rescue it, bring the jet to a stop. Suddenly he too wondered what was going to be for breakfast. Hey everybody, Sidekick here. I hope you enjoyed that little, somewhat different video. It was inspired by listening to the audiobook of Red Storm Rising and also seeing some of the other videos some other channels have been making, using that recording basically as the narration for their videos. I would point out, in case it wasn't obvious, that all of this material was original, though, not only read by me, but written by me as well. If you enjoyed this slightly different video, I really would appreciate getting some feedback. As always, if you're liking and subscribing, that's a big help. But also, if you wanted to leave some comments on the video or even come to the Discord channel, let me know what you thought about Boreal Backhand Part 2. And for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.